Today's occurrence happens in an underwater cave in Australia and took many modern divers by surprise. When a group of divers entered the tank cave in South Australia, they honestly expected a run-of-the-mill dive trip. Everyone in the group was really experienced, some more acclaimed than others, but for the most part, everyone was able to handle themselves. That is, until one experienced diver decided to venture beyond the end of the line, and things went very wrong. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the story of Agnes Milowka. Agnes was born in Poland in December of 1981, and her entire family moved to Melbourne, Australia when she was young. She showed signs of being a high achiever from a very young age. In school, she was a champion on the rowing team, a house captain, and a finalist in the Victoria Certificate of Education Achiever Award. It's my understanding that it's used for admissions to undergraduate programs at universities, kind of like the ACT or SAT here in America. She went on to receive several degrees, including a graduate degree and a couple of bachelor's degrees too. Agnes started diving in 2002, going as far as to say, after her first breath underwater at Ningaloo Reef in Western Australia, she knew that's what she wanted to do with her life. She went on to sign up for an open water course 2 weeks after that, and since then, diving literally became the center of her existence. Initially, she was into reefs and fish, and was president of the Melbourne University Underwater Club for a few years while she was enrolled. 2 years after that, she went snorkeling over Piccaninny Ponds in Mount Gambier. Agnes was swimming after a turtle, trying to get it, and she swam over the top of a large shaft hole entrance there. When she looked at it, she could see the shaft go down into what looked like the abyss, and the darkness just called to her. She watched a diver swim up from the shaft and knew she had to go down there one day. If the shaft in Australia at Mount Gambier sounds kind of familiar, I did an episode on it around this time last year, actually, called Deadliest Cave Diving Disasters, The Shaft, or something like that. I just mispronounced Gambier as Gambier the entire episode because that's how it's spelled. So hopefully I'm saying it right now, but shout out to the person who commented and told me that I was saying it wrong, so hopefully I'm redeeming myself. Agnes then went on to get certified for cave diving and started that adventure in 2005. She was full of life to everyone she met when diving and otherwise. Literally in every picture and interview, she's smiling, even when her answers are kind of grim. She got into diving shipwrecks around Australia, and when she did an internship in Florida with the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program, her work in helping with excavating historical shipwrecks during the internship introduced her to Florida diving. And in Florida, there are tons of cave systems to explore. And that led her to being the researcher and diver in multiple underwater research projects, which eventually led to at least 5 published articles and at least 10 publications that she contributed to. Diving unexplored areas was something that Agnes loved to do. She loved being the first to find things. In an interview, she said, it was dangerous because you don't know where you're going, you don't know what's ahead of you. She said, quote, anything could happen. Your bubbles could dislodge an avalanche. If you're lucky, you'll make it out. If you don't, you won't. End quote. Over the years, Agnes would dive for work in film and photography. In one documentary, she was an underwater supervisor. In 3 others, she worked as an underwater camera support technician, so she helped record and photograph underwater scenes for productions with National Geographic and Discovery Channel Japan. I think the most notable production she worked on was when she was an underwater stunt double for a James Cameron movie, the movie Sanctum. In 2009, Agnes took part in an 18-hour expedition in the Elk River Streamway in Victoria, Australia that expanded the cave system. After that expedition, the cave system was known to be 4,600 feet or 1,400 meters long and believed to possibly become the longest continuous passage in Victoria. By the summer of 2010, Agnes had done over 1,100 dives, with at least 500 being cave dives. 700 of the total dives are in Australia, most of the rest are in Florida, but there are a few in the UK and the Bahamas. Later that year, Agnes joined an expedition into Cocklebiddy Cave, which is actually in the desert. Getting out to the lake in the desert has a lot of physical labor involved, since you have to haul every single piece of equipment that you could possibly need out to the location. It's thousands of miles to the closest city, and according to Agnes, there's pretty much not a thing around except for dust, the hot sun, and strong wind. Once you make it to the location of the lake, you have to climb down a pretty lengthy rock pile. The cave has 3 sumps, so there's 3 underwater passages, and there's dry parts inside, which requires a lot of hauling equipment over steep mounds of rocks. It's humid and hot, and has a kinda elevated carbon dioxide level, but sump 3 at the end of it is so cooling that it's worth it. During that expedition, Agnes set the record for the longest cave dive in Australia for a woman. The guideline they were following was laid by a diver 2 years prior. The guy's name is Dr. Craig Challen, and he's a veterinarian. And he later helped with the Tam Luang Cave Rescue, the soccer team who got trapped in a cave and it turned into an international effort to save them. Well, the line Craig laid went like 66 feet or 20 meters further than where Agnes went because she had to turn around because of gas. She wasn't at all impressed with being the first female to achieve that record because, according to her, you're either the first or you're one of many. And since Craig made that record before her, she just wasn't impressed with herself at all. She also lost a light in the 3rd sump, but that wasn't a big deal because she had plenty of backups, like she should, so she just said that she was eager to go back to get it later. During times when she lived in Florida, she would lay thousands of feet of line in different cave systems and discovered thousands of feet of new passages too. She was known for squeezing into tight areas, even removing her air tanks to fit into the openings if she had to, which is called no mounting. So if divers are taking off their air tanks or gear to do whatever they need to do, it's called no mounting because they're taking off the things mounted on them. And as much as Agnes loved to dive and take videos and photos of that, she also loved to spread knowledge. So she spoke at several dive conferences too. Like Agnes Milowka is known as a really experienced diver. And at the end of 2010, she really started focusing on Tank Cave. Tank Cave is located in Mount Gambier and, according to Agnes, is the crowning jewel as far as cave divers are concerned because it really stands out from the crowd. It's not open to the public. There's strict control on who has access to the location because it's on private property and monitored by the Cave Divers Association of Australia. Honestly, most caves there are probably similar. Their diving association doesn't play at all, but Tank Cave is a very complicated system and requires a thorough and strategic process to familiarize divers to it. The cave system is maze-like. It looks like a crazy spiderweb with over 4 miles or 7 kilometers of passage. It's one of the longest caves in Australia. So divers have to go through a process to learn the cave step by step. Prior to even getting access to the site to go through the extensive step-by-step process, though, you have to go through like a million prior to that. So basically, anyone actually diving in this cave is extremely familiar with all of its main passages, even before they can look into any of the side tunnels that branch off, and they're experienced prior to even having access to Tank Cave. Agnes describes the cave as being stunning and a joy to dive. They don't have to fight a current inside, and the water is crystal clear. And the best part is that there's still so much left to explore. Many people believe that everything around Mount Gambier has already been found, but there's always something to discover in Tank Cave. You just have to be willing to squeeze through tight openings to find it. In early 2011, Agnes spent time diving shipwrecks, plane wrecks, and mapping caves. On February 27th, she was back at Tank Cave with a group of divers. The divers were from Victoria and planned to spend the entire weekend diving. The day before, Agnes tweeted, quote, "Another weekend of cave diving in Mount Gambier. Fabulous. Can't wait to get underground." End quote. On a previous dive at Tank Cave, she found a side passage 984 feet or 300 meters long, and she hoped to find another. On this dive, the group split up into buddies and started diving. Agnes had a buddy with her, and at some point towards the end of the dive, she found a tight opening she hadn't been through yet. Agnes wanted to go explore through the opening, but it wasn't quite big enough for another diver to follow her through, so Agnes went on to check it out alone. This wasn't a huge deal for Agnes specifically, but it is an acceptable practice if there's just not enough room for divers to safely go through an area together. And Agnes did admit in an interview that when you first learn to dive, it's drilled into you to have a buddy. But there's a point where you're exploring caves, and based on the environment, a buddy could be the thing likely to kill you. You just don't know what's going through their head, how they're going to act, and what their reaction will be when the stakes are high, and that's a liability that Agnes won't accept. So she went off on her own into the tight opening, and her buddy waited for her. But time passed, and Agnes didn't surface, so she was reported missing around 1:45 p.m. When more divers made it to the scene to look for her, the search ended up going overnight. Her remains were eventually found during the night search about 1,600 feet or 500 meters from the cave entrance. She wasn't easily accessible from where she was found, so members of Cave Diving Australia went back in to make sure the path to her remains was clear. The divers took video of the route so that police divers could easily figure out where to go get her. Where she was found was a very difficult squeeze to get through, and the idea to drill to her from the surface was tossed around, but ultimately not done. In the end, they said it took 3 to 5 days for them to remove her from the cave, and while it was never confirmed publicly by police exactly what happened, some divers have come forward on what they heard or believe happened. Allegedly, after leaving her diving buddy to go through that small opening, it was so tight that she took off one of her air tanks to go through. She had 2, so she left that tank as a backup and wanted to just continue on with the one tank. So she ended up taking off that air tank and used it to push through ahead of herself, so it was in front of her. But on her way back through, leaving the opening and heading towards that backup cylinder she left, she was delayed and her gas ran out and she drowned. It's believed the silt in the water contributed to her getting disoriented and not being able to get to the other tank in time. But she was within 16 feet or 5 meters of her backup, and it still had a lot of gas in it. Others have said that she went through the opening and tried to pull her tank through, but something happened and she lost her grip on a rebreather, so it fell out of her mouth, and she wasn't able to get back to her gear in time, or that she was lost in general. One diver even came forward and said that Agnes was calm until the end, tried to problem solve her way out, just like they're trained to do, until she took her last breath. But again, investigators didn't clearly say what happened, but it's believed that first situation is most likely what happened, with her just not making it back to her other tank in time because she was lost in the silt. Her father, Agnes Milowka, was obviously devastated that he lost his only child, but he was so proud of what she accomplished and her bravery. He described her as someone who wasn't happy to stop at the end of the line. She always had to explore further. She wasn't the type to have listened if he had told her to stop diving. She just wasn't built that way. Now, Agnes was considered very experienced and talented as a diver because of how she seemed to have no fear when doing things most others couldn't or wouldn't do. When Agnes was friends with another famous diver who had passed away, she was asked if it made her scared of diving at all. In that interview, she said she wasn't scared of diving because anyone at any time can pass away. She believed you have to live your life as if tomorrow is your last day. She went on to talk about how she loved to dive and was so passionate about it that nothing would stop her from doing it. But she understood the risks because in every extreme sport, there are risks. They are dangerous. She acknowledged that things don't always work out how you want them, but the goal is to do everything possible to keep diving over many years and not just to do that one dive. To her, the idea is longevity. She said, quote, "You have to dive safely, but live as if every day is going to be your last." End quote. Agnes was so petite and would squeeze through openings that most others wouldn't even consider trying, let alone be able to fit. I mean, she didn't seem to hesitate when she had to remove her gear, and a lot of divers won't even consider that. I wouldn't do that. But for those that would, Agnes said it's hard enough with one person trying to squeeze through tight openings, so having a buddy or someone else behind trying to push through it too isn't worth it, especially if there's zero visibility because of the silt. I'll be honest, watching her diving videos where she squeezes through these really tight openings, it feels weird because her technique is good. Like, she wasn't someone who didn't know what they were doing. It was pretty obvious she knew what she was doing. And I think I could fit through the places that she was squeezing through, but you wouldn't catch me even considering giving it a try because personally, I'm not willing to take off the very gear that would keep me alive. But that's why everyone respected her game, because she did it and she made it look easy, even though it kind of makes me panic watching her squeeze through those tight openings. Now, most of the information in this episode is from Agnes's own words and writing, but a lot of the discourse after her death was split. Like, most people were devastated, but not really surprised, partly because of her diving style, but also because of the unspoken acceptance that any dive could be anyone's last. And that's just something you have to accept when you're doing an extreme sport like that. Agnes was very clear about understanding that, but it was kind of strange looking back at how she wrote about dives and even Tank Cave. She felt like Tank Cave was very safe because of the training process and because it was only 66 feet or 20 meters deep. She dove it more times than anyone probably cared to keep track of, so it just kind of reminded people that you can never get too comfortable, and pushing the boundaries, no matter how experienced you are, doesn't always work out. But it was the talk about her role in Sanctum that made it feel eerie and foreboding in a way. Sanctum is inspired by a true story and about a cave diving team going through a life-threatening crisis on an expedition to the least accessible cave system in the world. And in the movie, that system is unexplored until this team tried to check it out. Agnes was the stunt diver for both of the females in the movie. In one of the scenes, the character Agnes stunted for had to leave an extra air tank behind to push through a tight squeeze. I won't spoil the movie for those who want to watch it, but it's just eerie that Agnes went on to do that same thing, to leave her spare air tank in order to squeeze through a passage, and that ultimately being what killed her. And don't get me wrong, people were and are still critical of her, saying she was reckless, but I try to look at it how a diver close to her ended up looking at it. Did she stuff herself in the back of the cave to take herself out? No, probably not, but she was a high achiever and they almost always push themselves. Pushing yourself in an unforgiving environment doesn't always work out. And in the words of the same diver, there are no accidents in cave diving, just fatalities, which is trivializing it a bit, but the idea is to get it through anyone new to the sport's head what people used to the sport know. And that's just how dangerous undertaking cave diving is. In May 2011, Agnes posthumously received the Exploration Award to recognize her outstanding and dedicated service to the National Speleological Society Cave Diving Section in America. She also had several different passages and chambers in caves named after her in Australia. Her name was featured in other awards too, like the Agnes Milowka Memorial Environmental Science Award. It was established by a media company for schools in areas of science, marine study, or exploration, since that's largely what Agnes studied while in university and what she spent her life doing. Agnes's death was the second in cave diving for Southeast Australia in that past year, and the second in 30 years in Mount Gambier systems. The year before, a 51-year-old doctor named Robert McAllister was diving in a sinkhole. His partner was ascending when he looked down and saw Robert pretty far below him, and he looked to be in trouble. The partner didn't have enough air to go back for Robert. He was actually taking his time ascending because he was trying to avoid the bends. But when he got to the surface as quickly as he could, he let people know, and Water Operations Police went down for Robert. Unfortunately, by the time they made it to him, it was too late. Robert was tangled in guide ropes and no longer alive. Cave diving in Australia has an exceptional record, especially compared to many other countries. By all appearances, they have learned from past tragedies, and they work to prevent future ones to the best of their ability. But things like this can happen whenever boundaries are pushed. Agnes Milowka's passing is seen as a huge loss in the diving community and a huge lesson. Stay safe, and I'll be back next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.